Slap tongue is a pretty cool technique to be able to play on your saxophone. Not only does it sound really good, but it's also becoming more and more of an expectation for more advanced players. What I'm going to offer you here are 4 different things to think about when it comes to learning slap tongue on your sax. So the first thing that I'm going to ask you to think about is the instrument and the mouthpiece choice. When I first started trying this technique, I found it a lot easier to play on the bigger instruments than the smaller instruments. So I did actually start on the bari sax, and I still find it quite difficult to play slap tongue accurately on the smaller instruments. 2 reasons for that, I feel, are the size of mouthpiece that you're using, but also the size of the instrument. The size of the instrument corresponds to how much that instrument's then going to resonate. I find the instruments that resonate that little bit more, you're going to achieve this technique a little bit easier. When it comes to mouthpieces, I've got a classical mouthpiece here and a jazz mouthpiece here. These are my tenor setups. Generally with a jazz mouthpiece, although not all the time, you're going to get a wider tip opening, which is the gap between the reed and the mouthpiece at the very top. Okay, the wider that tip opening, the easier or the more that reed is going to flex, and the easier it's going to be to achieve slap tongue. So I would recommend that you use a mouthpiece with a slightly wider tip opening. The next thing to think about would be note choice. Now, I wouldn't recommend just trying this technique to start with on just your mouthpiece or your mouthpiece and crook. Get your instrument together, and the notes that you should be trying are anything lower than a G. Again, the reason for that, I would say, is because of the way that the instrument resonates. I find it a lot easier to get this technique, to get the slap tongue with the lower notes on the instrument, and that doesn't matter which instrument you're playing, the lower notes should always speak a little bit easier. If you've not already realised, you're soon going to learn that you're going to go through quite a lot of reeds. This technique does tend to damage reeds when you first start trying it. So I would maybe even recommend buying a box of cheaper reeds, because you're not going to be bothered what your saxophone sounds like. You're trying this technique. Buy yourself a box of cheaper reeds so you're not turning your really expensive ones into something that looks like that. Another thing to think about is probably reducing the strength of your reed by about a half. This is all about the flexibility in the reed. With a softer reed, there's going to be that little bit more flexibility. It's going to be a little bit easier for you to achieve this technique. So buy yourself a box of really cheap reeds and go at least half a strength softer. The fourth and final thing to think about is probably the most important. It's the movement of your tongue itself. Now, there is often the suggestion that you should start practicing this technique or learning this technique with just your reed. I'm still unsure about whether that's going to be very useful. For me, it's just going to feel like you're having to learn the technique again when you get the reed on the mouthpiece. So I suggest, as I've just mentioned before, get the saxophone together and start learning this technique with the whole saxophone, not just the reed. One thing that really struck me when I got this technique was how aggressive the movement is of your tongue compared to what we're used to. We're quite used to, say this is your reed and this is your tongue. We're quite used to our tonguing being quite light. So the tongue touches the tip of the reed or somewhere on the reed to stop it from vibrating. That's normal tonguing. The action for me when I'm using slap tongue is really quite aggressive, and it's a downwards and forwards movement. So my tongue sits on the reed in very much the same way. It might be a little bit flatter against the reed, and I push my tongue forwards and down like this. And what that does, that brings the reed down, and it's that action there that causes the slap sound. I know I've just mentioned that it's not a useful thing to just use the reed when practicing slap tongue, but for demonstration purposes, just so you can see a little bit more clearly inside my mouth, I'm just going to demonstrate what the slap tongue actually looks like, or the position of my tongue. So the reed sits on my tongue a little bit flatter than when I'm tonguing normally, like that. Now if you watch as I'm slap tonguing, you'll see that my tongue, as I demonstrated before, moves forward and down. And now you can hear that there's not that click there that some people try and achieve before they move it onto their mouthpiece. I find that really quite difficult to get that sound on just my reed. Once I put the reed onto the mouthpiece, and it gets even easier the more of the saxophone you put together. Just to finish off, I will give you an example of the different types of slap tongue that you can achieve on the sax. I'll start off with the standard pitched slap. So I'm going to do a normal closed mouth slap tongue, and you're going to hear the pitch of the note that I'm actually fingering. The next one is the open mouth slap. Now this one is a lot more percussive. It's a loud effect. It's not as easy to achieve on the upper register, but it's quite a good one to get on the lower one. So I'll play with some of the lower notes, and I'll play an open mouth slap. One quite interesting thing about this is that the note that you're fingering isn't the pitch that comes out. Generally, it's about a minor third above. So if I'm fingering a low C, an open mouth slap with that note, I'm generally going to get about an E flat. The next one is a bell effect. And the final one is like a click slap, and this one is achieved by pushing no air through the instrument. So the reed's not really going to vibrate, the sound is just coming from the reed slapping against the mouthpiece. That's going to be the sound of this slap. So this is what I call a click slap. There are just a couple of different ways that we can play slap tongue on our saxophone. To summarise the 4 different things that I've just offered for you to get into slap tongue, you want to be thinking about the instrument and the mouthpiece choice. Generally, the bigger instruments are going to be easier to start on, and a mouthpiece with a bigger tip opening. The second thing was note choice. It's a lot easier to start this technique with some of the lower notes on the instrument, and that's whichever instrument you're using. The third thing to think about was reed choice. You're generally going to want to buy yourself a box of cheaper reeds and about half a strength softer than you're used to playing. And the fourth and final thing was the tongue itself. Just a few of the pointers on that. I would recommend that you don't just start with the reed. I would put the instrument together, start this technique with the whole sax. The other thing to think about as well is it's quite a lot different than the standard tonguing, so I would be a little bit more aggressive. Remember that movement of your tongue going down and forwards. That's the movement that you want. You want to grip that reed a little bit and pull it down and forwards, and that's how you're going to achieve that slap tongue effect. So I hope you found some of these things useful, even if it's just 1 or 2 of these things that might help you click and get this pretty cool technique. Thanks so much for watching this video, and I'll see you again next time.